procedurally, in order to get the Meech Lake Accords to become law. They were negotiated in 1987, and they needed to get approval from the remaining provinces within a 3-year timeline. That 3-year timeline is important, okay? And I'm just sort of giving you that as background because we're going to talk about sort of what happens here. When we talk about Quebec approves this really, really, really quickly, obviously, because it sort of meets their needs and their response to their desires in terms of their place in Confederation. But there is it sort of gets to be a growing concern that it's not going to get passed enough, and it actually gets pretty close down to the wire as far as it goes. So if you hear some conversation around the Meech Lake Accords, one of the names that comes up really quickly is a man by the name of Elijah Harper, and we're going to talk a little bit about Elijah Harper and his sort of place in this. Elijah Harper was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba, and he's also an Indigenous person, and that's important, okay? And because this process was getting down to the wire, and it was sort of getting to the point where if Manitoba didn't pass it, this thing wasn't passing at all. Just because of the timelines and who was not even interested in passing it and who was, and sort of where the population was, this came down to a timeline in Manitoba. But the government of Manitoba had kind of drug its feet for a while on this one. So by the time this comes up, they don't have enough time to go through the full public consultation process that would have been necessary under the sort of like ordinary laws. Now, if you're designing laws appropriately and a legal structure appropriately, you typically build in rules and regulations that you can use to sort of step around those processes. We saw that in the spring when you had many governments sort of saying, yeah, we're using Emergency Powers Act because we need to change this stuff around COVID really, really quickly. So in this case, what's happening is the government of Manitoba had a possibility that you could skip the public consultations on a law like this on the assumption, with the requirement, that you had unanimous consent from the Legislative Assembly to allow them to skip the public consultations, okay? This makes for a sort of tense negotiation piece, and as far as it goes, every single member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly said, yes, it's fine, skip the consultations if you need to, except Elijah Harper. And he is the only no vote, and he's making a point of doing that, in that there's some really lovely photographs of Mr. Harper standing there holding an eagle feather saying, yeah, no. And he's often seen as responsible for killing the Meech Lake Accords and sort of preventing that sort of constitutional change all on his own. And his argument and his reason for not supporting that is not that his constituents sort of in Manitoba weren't really happy with it, because they probably didn't care that much, but he was responding to the fact that this is an entire attempt to change the Constitution, and it doesn't address any of the Indigenous issues. None of them. There's no space in the Meech Lake Accords for self-governance. There's no space in the Meech Lake Accords to talk about what treaty law looks like. None of that stuff is there. And they didn't even ask Indigenous leaders what they might like to be able to sort of bring together those groups in terms of fitting into an environment and a shared confederation. So his no vote is really not about sort of just he personally didn't like it. It's a no vote that comes from a rejection of this process and of this particular set of accords from the sort of side of Indigenous people. And he's often portrayed as having killed the Meech Lake Accords. And that is in some ways just because it makes a better story. If you actually really dig into the history, one of the things that you'll find is that that 3-year time period is kind of important. For example, I believe it's Nova Scotia, but it might be Newfoundland. Double check my details on that one. Had passed the Meech Lake Accords really early on in this process, but then they had a provincial election, and so the later provincial government revoked their their agreement with the Accords, and that sort of is part of what creates this tension around Manitoba. There are a lot of things that mean that we don't pass the Leech Lake Accords, but the big story one, the one that everyone talks about, is Elijah Harper and this eagle feather. And it's important to know his name. You guys know that I've sort of been pretty big this semester about talking about agency among Indigenous people, and to sort of talk about Canada's Indigenous people as actors in creating, in attempting to create what they need and sort of active in that pursuit, rather than sort of describing them as passive things, passive sort of objects to which things happen. So this is one of the reasons that we're talking about Elijah Harper, and also because it's kind of important. You guys will sort of hear about his name. Okay, so that is the end of the Meech Lake Accords, but it is not the end of our attempts at constitutional change. That comes in after the Charlottetown Accord, which is our next video.